On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet soldiers met at the Elbe River in Germany. They shook hands, exchanged cigarettes, posed for photographs, and celebrated the approaching defeat of Nazi Germany. For a brief moment, the alliance looked permanent. Less than 4 years later, the same two powers were confronting each other across a divided Berlin, building military blocs, expanding nuclear arsenals, and preparing for a war either side believed it could safely fight. How did victory over a common enemy create the Cold War? The simplest answer is that the United States and the Soviet Union had never truly become friends. They had formed an alliance of necessity against Nazi Germany. Once that enemy disappeared, the differences they had temporarily set aside returned with greater force. But ideology alone does not explain what followed. Capitalism and communism had opposed each other since the Russian Revolution of 1917, yet that rivalry had not automatically produced a global confrontation. The Cold War emerged because ideology became connected to military power, devastated territory, nuclear weapons, and a struggle over who would shape the political order after 1945. It was not created by one speech, one conference, or one leader. It developed through a chain of decisions in which each side increasingly treated the other's search for security as evidence of aggression. The Soviet Union entered the postwar world with enormous military power, but also with a deep sense of vulnerability. German armies had invaded Russian or Soviet territory twice within a generation. The Second World War had devastated western regions of the Soviet Union and killed millions of Soviet citizens. From Stalin's perspective, friendly governments in Eastern Europe could serve as a protective barrier against another attack from the West. But the countries inside that barrier were not empty spaces. Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and others had their own political movements, national interests, and expectations of independence. As Soviet influence expanded, communist parties gained control of police forces, ministries, media, and electoral systems. Opposition groups were restricted, divided, intimidated, or removed. What Moscow described as a defensive security zone appeared to Washington and London as the construction of an empire. The United States entered the postwar world with a very different experience. Its mainland had not been devastated. Its industrial capacity had expanded during the war, its navy and air power reached across the globe, and for a short period it possessed the world's only atomic weapons. American leaders believed that another depression, another collapse of international trade, or another retreat into isolationism could produce the same instability that had preceded the Second World War. They therefore wanted open markets, functioning European economies, and governments able to resist authoritarian takeover. But from Moscow's perspective, American economic influence, military access, and nuclear superiority could also look like an expanding system designed to surround and weaken the Soviet Union. The first serious disagreements appeared before the war had even ended. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin discussed Germany, Poland, the United Nations, and the political future of liberated Europe. Their agreements contained language about representative government and elections, but the meaning of those promises remained disputed. The Red Army already occupied much of Eastern Europe. Western leaders could negotiate with Stalin, but they could not easily remove Soviet forces from territory they had conquered at immense cost. When the leaders met again at Potsdam in July 1945, Germany had surrendered, Roosevelt had died, Harry Truman had become president, and Britain changed prime ministers during the conference. The common enemy in Europe was gone. Disputes over German reparations, Polish borders, occupation policy, and political control became harder to conceal. Truman also knew that the United States had successfully tested an atomic bomb. He informed Stalin that America possessed a powerful new weapon, but Stalin already knew about the project through Soviet intelligence. The bomb did not force Soviet concessions. It increased Soviet fears that the United States might use nuclear superiority as political pressure, while giving some American officials greater confidence in dealing with Moscow. Germany became the central testing ground. The country was divided into American, British, French, and Soviet occupation zones. Berlin was also divided, even though the city lay deep inside the Soviet zone. At first, the Allies officially agreed that Germany should be treated as one economic unit. In practice, they pursued increasingly different goals. The Soviet Union removed industrial equipment and demanded reparations to compensate for wartime destruction. Western officials gradually concluded that Europe could not recover if Germany remained economically disabled. They began combining their zones and rebuilding production. Each policy had its own logic. Together, they pushed Germany toward permanent division. During 1946, public language hardened. In February, American diplomat George Kennan sent his long telegram from Moscow, arguing that Soviet leaders viewed lasting conflict with capitalism as unavoidable and that Soviet expansion should be contained through patient, firm resistance. In March, Winston Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Stalin responded by portraying Churchill's speech as a call for Anglo-American domination. None of these statements started the Cold War by themselves. They gave a name and structure to suspicions that were already shaping policy. By early 1947, the rivalry moved from warning to commitment. Britain informed the United States that it could no longer support the governments of Greece and Turkey. Greece was emerging from occupation into civil conflict, while Turkey faced Soviet pressure over regional access and security. On March 12, President Truman asked Congress for $400 million in assistance. He described a world divided between alternative political systems and declared that the United States should support peoples resisting coercion from armed minorities or outside pressure. The immediate request concerned Greece and Turkey, but the Truman Doctrine announced a much broader change. The United States would no longer assume that instability in distant countries was someone else's problem. It was adopting containment as a global responsibility. This was one of the clearest moments when the Cold War became official policy. Yet military and political aid alone could not solve Europe's crisis. Cities remained damaged, transportation systems were broken, food and fuel were scarce, and communist parties had gained support in several Western European countries. In June 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a program of large-scale economic assistance. The offer was formally open to European countries, including the Soviet Union and states under Soviet influence, but participation required economic information and cooperation that Stalin considered threatening. Moscow rejected the program and pressured Eastern European governments to do the same. The United States then funded the recovery of Western Europe through the Marshall Plan. American policymakers presented the program as a defense against hunger, desperation, political collapse, and communist expansion. It also tied Western European recovery to American capital, trade, and leadership. The Soviet Union responded by tightening coordination inside Eastern Europe. Europe was no longer simply recovering from war. It was being organized into rival economic and political systems. The decisive confrontation came in Berlin. In 1948, the Western powers introduced a new currency in their German zones to stabilize the economy. The Soviet Union viewed the reform as another step toward creating a separate West German state. In June, Soviet authorities blocked rail, road, and water access to the western sectors of Berlin. More than 2 million people were suddenly dependent on supplies that could no longer arrive by land. The Western powers faced a dangerous choice. Leaving Berlin would damage their credibility and hand the entire city to Soviet control. Forcing a ground convoy through the blockade could trigger direct fighting. Instead, the United States and Britain organized an airlift. Cargo aircraft delivered food, coal, medicine, and other supplies through narrow air corridors. Flights became increasingly frequent and efficient. The operation lasted through the winter and demonstrated that the Western powers could sustain Berlin without opening fire. In May 1949, the blockade was lifted. The crisis had not reunited Germany. It accelerated the division. West Germany was established later that month, and East Germany followed in October. NATO had already been created in April. The wartime alliance was now replaced by opposing states, military planning, and permanent political boundaries. By 1949, the basic Cold War system was visible. The United States had adopted containment, supported Western European recovery, maintained forces overseas, and helped create an Atlantic alliance. The Soviet Union had consolidated control over Eastern Europe, built institutions to coordinate communist governments, and tested its first atomic bomb. China's Communist Revolution later that year expanded the conflict beyond Europe. The Cold War would soon reach Korea, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and even outer space. But was the conflict inevitable? Historians still disagree. One interpretation emphasizes Soviet expansion and Stalin's unwillingness to allow genuine political independence in Eastern Europe. Another emphasizes American economic power, nuclear diplomacy, and the expansion of a global system favorable to the United States. A more convincing explanation combines security fears with political choice. The Soviet Union had legitimate reasons to fear another invasion, but security did not require suppressing independent governments across Eastern Europe. The United States had legitimate reasons to support European recovery, but its leaders often described complex local conflicts as parts of a single worldwide communist threat. Both sides interpreted uncertainty through the darkest possible assumptions. Defensive measures became threatening signals. Threatening signals produced stronger defensive measures. This cycle is known as a security dilemma. One side tries to become safer, and in doing so makes the other side feel less safe. World War II created the conditions for that dilemma. It destroyed Germany and Japan as great powers, weakened Britain and France, left Soviet armies across Eastern Europe, elevated the United States to unprecedented global power, and introduced nuclear weapons into international politics. The war removed the old balance of power before a trusted new system could replace it. The United Nations existed, but it could not erase the conflict between its most powerful members. The result was not immediate war between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was something more stable and more dangerous, a long confrontation in which both sides prepared constantly for a direct conflict they worked desperately to avoid. The Cold War began not when former allies suddenly became enemies, but when they built institutions around the belief that cooperation was no longer safe. By the time the Berlin blockade ended, mistrust had become doctrine, doctrine had become money and military planning, and temporary occupation lines had become the borders of a divided Europe. The Second World War had ended with the defeat of one expansionist empire. Its aftermath created two rival systems powerful enough to divide the world. But before those systems could claim moral authority, the victorious Allies faced another question: how could the leaders of the defeated regime be judged for crimes that had transformed the meaning of war itself? That question would be answered at Nuremberg.